Hello everyone, this is the fourth episode in the Age of Pandemic series, and like the last one, I'm going to begin with a Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen. Way back in 1982, the world-famous economist and philosopher Amartya Sen had expressed a hypothesis that the institution of the free press can act as a firewall against famine. He said, "Famines are extremely easy to prevent if the government tries to prevent them. And a government in a multi-party democracy with elections and free media has strong political incentives to undertake famine prevention." Given that the free press plays a role in holding democratic governments accountable to the people, the question I'm going to ask in today's episode is this: can the institution of the free press prevent pandemics? The short answer, I think, is this. If the pen is mightier than the sword, then maybe, with some work of course, the dread of pandemics in the 21st century could end. If the free press rallies for issues like public health and social security, the citizens of democracies will not be vulnerable to pandemics. Famines used to happen frequently throughout history and did occur even in the 20th century. Amartya Babu's own childhood was against the backdrop of the Bengal famine of 1943, the great man-made disaster that resulted in over 3 million deaths. Amartya Sen devoted a large part of his research into the causes of famine and discovered, with empirical research, that while poverty and its myriad problems like hunger and malnutrition are part of the reality of poor nations, famines, that is, mass deaths caused by hunger, cannot happen in democracies. According to him, in a democratic system where there is a free press, the occurrence of famine reduces the popularity of the government. So, the fear of being voted out of power is what motivates democratic governments to take measures to prevent or at least mitigate famines. But a free press can be effective only when that freedom is utilized fully and not in a biased or slanted way. But the might of the pen, the great power of the press, is under threat. Let's explore why. The coronavirus/COVID-19 pandemic was waiting to happen. In recent weeks, a figure out of ancient Greek mythology, Cassandra, has been referenced many times in world media. Cassandra was a priestess who gave true prophecies, but her prophecies were never believed when they should have been, and as a result, disasters were not really prevented. On coronavirus, we had several Cassandras. The most famous one is the journalist Laurie Garrett. In 1994, Laurie Garrett wrote a book called The Coming Plague, in which she warned that a global pandemic was imminent and that its effects would devastate societies and economy to such an extent that generations would suffer. And then in 2005, she wrote an essay titled The Next Pandemic, in which she discusses a possible flu pandemic and said, the entire world would experience similar levels of viral carnage. In response, some countries might impose useless but highly disruptive quarantines or close borders and airports, perhaps for months. Such closures would disrupt trade, travel, and productivity. On 8th January 2020, Laurie Garrett even warned the world that the Chinese government was trying to cover up the outbreak of COVID-19. This was in an opinion piece she'd written for foreignpolicy.com. She even said that China had tried to cover up the SARS outbreak instead of trying to prevent it. There are several others, like Michael Osterholm, an epidemiologist from Minnesota, USA.
15 years ago, an American infectious diseases expert predicted a global pandemic like coronavirus would cause pretty much everything that we're currently living through. Dr. Michael Osterholm outlined a battle plan to get through it in his book Deadliest Enemy, Our War Against Killer Germs, set to be re-released next week. Dr. Osterholm, you've been warning about a pandemic for more than a decade, and yet from SARS to Ebola to now this very severe one, we keep getting caught by surprise and on the back foot. Why?
Well, I think, first of all, we really lack creative imagination. And what I mean by that is no one could have envisioned, so they say, all the constellation of things that have happened here, not just a virus crossing from an animal to a human, but that the worldwide transmission, the impact that it has on healthcare, the fact that it also shuts down our global economy. And ironically, those are things we actually published back in 2005 in a series of articles I did back then. And then, of course, elaborated on our book in 2017, Deadliest Enemies, where actually one of the chapters is a theoretical kind of scenario caused by an influenza virus, but it could very well be a coronavirus, of which it's exactly the very same. So we should have been able to consider this and be better prepared, but we just weren't.
But the free press, including the mainstream media, reported none of it at the time. Alana Sheikh, a global health consultant, said this in a recent TED Talk.
Politicians, government officials, when they know that they're going to get quarantined if they talk about outbreaks and cases, may conceal real information for fear of triggering a quarantine protocol. And of course, these kinds of evasions and dishonesty are exactly what it makes it so difficult to track a disease outbreak.
Now, this is a thorny issue, and it is an old issue. See, we are constantly informed about the shenanigans of the rich and famous, the mundane political slugfests, the nonsensical diplomatic tussles. For example, so many of us remember the celebrity weddings that happened in 2018. They were reported in such detail that it's almost as if we attended the weddings. However, in Feb-March 2018, the World Health Organization had said that the world should watch out for disease X. Do any of us remember reading what that was? Did any of us bother to visit the websites of the World Health Organization or Lancet magazine? But have a look at this. This op-ed published recently in the New York Times says that in February 2018, the World Health Organization held informal consultations to review the list of diseases for research and development purposes. They were seriously deliberating on the next pandemic, which they were sure was about to emerge. But they were yet to hit the nail on the head. So they named the next pandemic Disease X. There was barely any coverage on this in the popular press. But if you and I went and searched the internet as aware global citizens, we would have found the entire report of this conference in PDF form. So you and I just placed our faith in our popularly elected government to react appropriately to a warning like this. After all, this report was circulated among 185 member countries of the World Health Organization. We expected our governments to have acted on this report, to have put in place research laboratories, built enough hospitals just like those bomb shelters during the Cold War. But they did nothing of the sort. And the free press? We had outsourced our conscientiousness on grave matters to the fourth estate. They should have had people on the job to pressure the governments to act on the report. But they did nothing of the sort. With SARS, Middle Eastern flu, and Ebola in recent memory, the free press ought to have alerted the public of the pandemic being predicted by the World Health Organization with at least a fraction of the coverage that the royal wedding got, instead of warning us about asteroids that are statistically unlikely to come. And so, 2 years later, Disease X became COVID-19. I wonder, what can be done to make the free press of democratic countries report responsibly on pandemics? I mean, the political elites need to feel uncomfortable about omitting this issue from their manifestos. There should be some pressure on the politicians so that they never finish a speech without saying how much they are doing or what is their individual contribution towards preventing the next pandemic. Did you notice that the COVID-19 pandemic has struck most ferociously in the most democratic and economically advanced nations, countries with the leading GDP figures? Once the coronavirus struck, suddenly the world's economic powerhouses, the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, India, France, Australia, Spain, democracies, all of them, realized that they did not have enough resources to treat the victims. They had the world's most advanced fighter jets, sophisticated scientific establishments, space missions, but not enough hospital beds, not enough doctors and medics, and not even enough face masks. Did you know Bill Gates warned way back in 2015 that the world was ill-equipped to deal with a pandemic? Bill Gates highlighted that although nations were very well prepared to go to war, drugs and vaccines cannot be developed quickly when an epidemic breaks. He said, "We need a global warning and response system for outbreaks. It would start with strengthening poor countries' health systems. We also need to invest in disease surveillance. We need a case database, rules requiring countries to share their information, lists of trained personnel." He also said that more investment was required for drugs, vaccines, and diagnostic tests. So, our free press is obsessed with national security. It understands bombs and stuff. But what about biosecurity? In the United States of America, one of the world's richest countries, and it's also some kind of gold standard for democratic governance, a department created to prepare for pandemics by one president was dismantled in 2017 by another president. And the free press of that country did not even bother to report it at the time. But when coronavirus struck, they started bickering about it. Anyway, did the great, vibrant news media of these countries highlight that their leaders did not budget enough for healthcare? The government's insufficient spending or general lack of preparedness for pandemics, despite being warned that there might be one, certainly did not make the headlines. For decades, these democratic governments were not held accountable to the public for this failure of theirs that has now come to cost their citizens so dearly. The news media can argue, perhaps convincingly, that they can hardly be faulted. Since the turn of the last century, newspapers, that very foundation of the fourth estates, have been dying. Their business model of advertising revenue, which subsidizes low retail pricing, has crashed because advertising revenue first went away to television, that is the idiot box, and then, after the explosion of social media, to digital platforms.
Steve Cavendish, I'm going to start with you. You wrote the other day that what's going on right now for journalists is a bloodbath. Is it really that bad?
Well, it has been over a long period of time. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen journalism jobs around the country be cleaved off at a rate like either coal miners or steel workers or fishermen. And those are not what you would call thriving industries. Journalism has had revenue problems for years, and we're starting to see as print is really sort of wiped out, that the conversion over to digital for many of these properties, many of these newspapers, just isn't the same. And so we're seeing with it a lot of jobs lost.
In India, the condition of newspapers is, theoretically speaking, not that bad. Compared to the developed countries, the print platforms are still thriving. But what prevents them from being more responsible? Growing and deepening provincialism.
The Indian newspaper industry grew by over 7% last year despite the economic slowdown, but that was little consolation to the country's media houses used to double-digit growth. They have shifted their focus on the regional markets where they see a bigger potential.
Demand is mostly from the non-metro places. So what we do is all of us are starting local or hyper-local editions. Not long ago we had only single edition catering the whole geography from Calcutta. Now we have about 24 editions, and it's growing. 24 within the next 2 years it could be 50. So everybody is doing that. So we're going nearer to the market and creating a newspaper based on local needs, giving local flavor.
Right now, we need globalized minds, and the messengers of tidings, good, bad, and very bad, should not be cocooning themselves. We are told that in the months to come, human society is expected to face waves of contagion. Fear has done to human societies what love could not: unite people in their aspiration for better social support systems from their government. So, I fear two disasters will happen. In developed countries, the serious media, by which I mean print and small sectors of the non-fiction TV and digital media, will be debilitated by poverty or insolvency or both. They will be unable to recruit qualified, competent professionals. They will be left hand to mouth with no budgets for research and investigation. The glory days of the fourth estate in the developed countries might be a thing of the past. On the other hand, in developing countries like India, newspapers will struggle to maintain local or sub-local identities. Their owners might not even see much business sense in bringing the world to its readers. Also, they might have themselves created the intellectual insularity and mental distance from even the next state within the country. So, this explosion of small-townism will see micro-interests taking up newspaper space, like a local luminary's wedding or dispute over property demarcation. And in an obscure little corner of an inside page, we will read about a new strain of coronavirus emerging in another part of the globe, or the disproportionate allocation for healthcare in the national budget. Look at this experience. Even during the coronavirus pandemic, People in India continue to die of dengue, malaria, and the H1N1 virus, which is also a type of coronavirus. But beyond a national newspaper or two, this news was barely covered in the vast free press of India, the world's largest democracy. All this adds up to another serious fault line within democracy itself. With more and more waves of the coronavirus, politicians will get more and more authoritarian. They will be questioned less and less on their attention deficit / incompetence. And the very newspapers, free press, that Amartya had counted on to defeat famines will be nowhere in the picture on pandemics. Even though famines haven't happened, people continue to literally starve to death in many parts of India. You see, the free press of India treats poverty as maybe the condition of some people who don't read their newspapers and magazines. This normalization of starvation by the free press does add up, brick by brick, to a silent famine because the political elite do not consider themselves accountable. If the press doesn't ask questions, the government will not volunteer to give answers that matter, and what they say will only be propaganda. Thank you for watching this episode, and thank you for all your support and feedback. In the next episode, I will talk about the goodness in human beings brought out by the coronavirus pandemic and the bad. Just one thing before I wrap up. Even if we were to subscribe to the war imagery and call our present situation a war against the coronavirus, please remember two things about war. The first is that truth is the first casualty in a war. And secondly, war brings out the worst in human beings. See you next week. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and do follow me on Twitter and Instagram for daily updates. Stay safe and have a good weekend.